Maria Antonia of Austria was born on the 18th of January 1669 in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the capital of Austria. Her birth was celebrated with all the pomp and circumstance befitting a Habsburg princess, with cannon salutes, church bells ringing throughout Vienna, and lavish gifts presented by foreign dignitaries. Yet beneath the golden cradle and silk blankets lay a child carrying the heaviest genetic burden any European royal had ever borne. Her father was Leopold I, a man of immense power and influence. He was Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia, ruling over vast territories that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Leopold was known for his distinctive physical features, the famous protruding Habsburg jaw that made eating difficult, along with an unusually large lower lip and a notably elongated face. Her mother was Margaret Theresa of Spain, a daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Margaret Theresa was only 21 when she gave birth to Maria Antonia and would be dead by 22, her body worn out from multiple pregnancies and likely compromised by her own inbred genetics. As you may or may not be aware, both of Maria Antonia's parents came from the mighty House of Habsburg, a dynasty that had conquered much of Europe, not through war, but thanks to strategic marriages and a bit of luck. The Habsburg motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," perfectly captured their approach to empire building. Through carefully arranged unions, they had assembled territories including Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and the vast Spanish Empire, which included much of the Americas. The House of Habsburg had royal lines in both Spain and Austria, and they had been intermarrying since the early 1500s. Initially, these marriages were strategic alliances meant to cement political bonds between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family. But as time passed, their obsession with keeping power within the family turned into something far more twisted. They weren't just marrying distant relatives anymore. No, they took it to extremes that would make modern geneticists shudder. Second cousins, first cousins, even uncles and nieces became common marriage partners within the Habsburg family tree. The practice began innocently enough with marriages between second or third cousins, common enough among European royalty. But by the 16th century, the Habsburgs had begun regularly arranging marriages between uncles and nieces or first cousins. Philip IV married his niece Mariana of Austria. Charles II of Spain's parents were uncle and niece. And these centuries of relentless inbreeding culminated in Maria Antonia. She wasn't just the product of one unfortunate match. She was the result of generation after generation of close, family marriages compounding the dynasty's genetic decay. Of course, her parents were uncle and niece, but the inbreeding went much deeper than that single relationship. Modern geneticists have calculated that Maria Antonia had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.3053, which means that over 30% of her genes contained identical alleles from the same ancestors. For comparison, the offspring of a brother-sister union would have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Maria Antonia's coefficient exceeded even that of her infamous Spanish cousin, Charles II, whose severe deformities and mental disabilities made him unable to chew his food and left him unable to produce an heir. Remarkably, despite her genetic burden, Maria Antonia survived infancy. This was no small feat in the 17th century, when infant mortality was high even among the healthiest of children. For a child with such extreme inbreeding, survival was nothing short of miraculous. Her physical appearance has been described in contemporary accounts as relatively normal by Habsburg standards. She had the characteristic jutting jaw and elongated face, but not to the extreme degree seen in some family members. Her mental faculties appeared intact, though historical records suggest she was prone to melancholy and suffered from fragile health throughout her short life. Maria Antonia's mother, Margaret Theresa, had given birth to 4 children, but only Maria Antonia survived past the age of 7. Her 3 siblings, Ferdinand Wenzel, Maria Anna, and Johann Leopold, all died in early childhood, likely victims of the same genetic calamity that threatened Maria Antonia. With her mother's death, when Maria Antonia was just 3 years old, the young princess became the sole surviving direct descendant of her mother's line. This placed enormous pressure on the young girl's shoulders. She was not just a princess, she was a living repository of claims to multiple thrones, a pawn in the grand European chess game of dynastic politics. And as we will see, Her value as a marriage prospect would soon outweigh any consideration for her happiness or well-being. The stage was set for a life that would be defined by duty, suffering, and the inescapable consequences of her family's centuries-long genetic experiment. Maria Antonia's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of one of history's most notorious genetic experiments, the Habsburg dynasty's centuries-long practice of marrying within their own family. The consequences of this inbreeding reached their apex in Maria Antonia's generation, creating a web of biological relationships so tangled that conventional family terms became almost meaningless. Her mother Margaret Theresa had indeed affectionately called her husband uncle, because Leopold was, in fact, both her first cousin and her maternal uncle. This extreme consanguinity resulted in Maria Antonia having an inbreeding coefficient higher than what would be found in children born from parent, offspring, or sibling unions, a staggering biological reality that made her technically the most inbred Habsburg in the dynasty's history. The Habsburg approach to marriage had always been strategic rather than romantic, encapsulated in the famous motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." For generations, the family had carefully orchestrated unions to consolidate territories, secure alliances, and keep power within their bloodline. By the 17th century, this policy had created a closed genetic loop where cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and the family tree resembled not a branching oak, but a tangled vine folding back upon itself. The physical manifestations of this inbreeding had become increasingly apparent: the distinctive Habsburg jaw, prognathism, elongated faces, and a host of health problems that plagued family members. Charles II of Spain, Maria Antonia's uncle, embodied the worst outcomes of these practices. Known as El Hechizado, the bewitched, Charles suffered from a litany of physical and mental disabilities: a severely deformed jaw that made eating difficult, a tongue too large for his mouth, and intellectual development that never progressed beyond childhood. Court physicians described him as short, weak, and sickly, noting that he has a very pale complexion, a curved spine, knock knees, and feet that turn inward when he walks. Incapable of producing an heir despite 2 marriages, Charles would become the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, his body the biological dead end of a once mighty dynasty. Against this backdrop, Maria Antonia's relatively normal development seemed nothing short of miraculous. While her siblings succumbed to the genetic burden they carried, her brother Ferdinand dying before her birth, and 2 other siblings, John and Maria Anna, surviving mere hours or days after birth, Maria Antonia somehow defied the odds. Court physicians monitored her closely for signs of the family ailments, but she displayed remarkable health compared to her relations. This biological lottery win made her increasingly valuable to her father and the dynasty's future. The death of her mother Margaret Theresa in March 1673 marked a pivotal moment in Maria Antonia's young life. At just 4 years old, she lost not only her mother, but also her primary protector and advocate at court. The frail queen, herself a product of Habsburg inbreeding, had succumbed to the physical weaknesses that characterized her bloodline, dying at the tragically young age of 21. Maria Antonia's position at court transformed overnight. As the sole surviving child of Leopold's first marriage, she became a crucial link in the chain of succession, particularly to the Spanish throne, where her uncle Charles II's inability to produce heirs was becoming increasingly concerning to European powers. Through her mother, Maria Antonia carried the strongest claim to the vast Spanish Empire should her uncle die childless, as seemed increasingly likely. This inheritance would include not just Spain itself, but also territories in Italy, the Netherlands, and extensive colonial possessions across the Americas and Pacific. Leopold I, recognizing his daughter's strategic importance, began to treat her differently. Court records indicate an increase in the resources dedicated to her care and education, and the emperor commissioned several portraits of his daughter to be sent to courts across Europe. These portraits served as visual reminders of the Habsburg presence and continuity, showcasing Maria Antonia as the embodiment of dynastic legitimacy during uncertain times. Spanish courtiers began to pay special attention to the young archduchess, with some even suggesting she be brought to Madrid to be raised as the presumptive heir under Spanish influence. The proposal alarmed Leopold, who understood that whoever controlled Maria Antonia effectively controlled the future of the Spanish Empire. He refused these overtures, keeping his daughter firmly under his protection in Vienna. For Maria Antonia, these political machinations meant a childhood unlike that of most royal children. Her education intensified, with particular emphasis on Spanish language, history, and customs. She was increasingly included in court ceremonies where Spanish ambassadors were present, carefully dressed and positioned to emphasize her connection to both branches of the Habsburg family. The young princess became a living symbol of dynastic continuity at a time when the future of Habsburg power hung in the balance. As European powers began to position themselves for the eventual struggle over the Spanish succession, Maria Antonia stood at the center of a diplomatic storm, a child whose bloodline made her simultaneously the product of her family's greatest mistake and their greatest hope. Her very existence represented both the culmination of the Habsburg inbreeding crisis and, potentially, its solution through strategic marriage to new bloodlines. Maria Antonia's childhood was shaped by the constant awareness that her body was not truly her own. Her blood and womb belonged to the Habsburg dynasty, tools in an elaborate game of succession and power. When her mother died in 1673, the stakes of this game rose dramatically. As 11-year-old Maria Antonia became the presumptive heir to the vast Spanish Empire ruled by her uncle Charles II. The Spanish inheritance was the greatest prize in Europe, a sprawling empire that included not just Spain, but territories in Italy, the Netherlands, and vast colonial possessions across the Americas and Pacific. For the Habsburg dynasty, keeping this inheritance within the family was paramount, even if it meant contemplating marriages that pushed the boundaries of acceptable consanguinity. Charles Cyr himself was the embodiment of Habsburg inbreeding gone terribly wrong. His jaw protruded so severely that he could barely close his mouth to chew, forcing him to subsist largely on soft foods that required minimal mastication. His tongue was oversized for his deformed mouth, making speech difficult and often unintelligible. He suffered from digestive ailments, epileptic seizures, and a fragility that kept him bedridden for long stretches of his life. Most concerning for the dynasty, Charles showed no signs of being able to produce an heir. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans remained childless, despite desperate attempts and prayers throughout the Catholic world. This reproductive failure was hardly surprising given Charles's physical condition. Courtiers whispered that the king's genitals were as deformed as his jaw. Emperor Leopold, Maria Antonia's father, recognized that his daughter had become a crucial chess piece in the European power game. If Charles died without an heir, Maria Antonia's claim to the Spanish throne would be among the strongest. Leopold began formulating a strategy that would seem shocking to modern sensibilities, but was perfectly logical within the Habsburg dynastic mindset. He proposed that Maria Antonia marry her own uncle, Charles II of Spain. This marriage would have represented one of the most extreme cases of royal inbreeding in European history, a niece marrying an uncle who was already severely disabled from generations of consanguineous marriages. The age gap was considerable as well. Charles was 14 years older than his niece. Yet for Leopold, these concerns paled beside the imperative of securing the Spanish inheritance. The proposed match ultimately collapsed, not because of moral qualms about the close blood relationship, but because of political opposition from other European powers who feared the concentration of Habsburg power. France in particular viewed the prospect of reuniting the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg lines with alarm, seeing it as a direct threat to French security. When the Spanish match failed, Leopold quickly sought alternative arrangements for his daughter. After brief negotiations with the Duke of Savoy fell through, he settled on Maximilian II Emmanuel, the young Elector of Bavaria, as Maria Antonia's husband. The Bavarian match served multiple strategic purposes. It secured an ally in southern Germany, created a buffer against French expansion, and maintained Maria Antonia's claim to the Spanish succession while bringing it under control of a dynasty friendly to Habsburg interests. In 1685, at age 17, Maria Antonia was married to Maximilian in a lavish ceremony in Vienna. The marriage contract included a crucial clause. Maria Antonia was required to renounce her Spanish succession rights, but with a significant exception. If Charles Sick had died without heirs, her claim would be transferred to any son she might bear. This legal maneuver was Leopold's insurance policy, ensuring that even if the Spanish crown passed from the Habsburg name, it would remain within Habsburg blood. The young bride traveled to Munich with a substantial dowry and high expectations, but her personal happiness was secondary to dynastic considerations. From the beginning, the marriage proved difficult. Maximilian, 7 years older than his bride, was a man of action who preferred hunting, military campaigns, and the company of mistresses to the intellectual pursuits that interested Maria Antonia. While Maria Antonia had been raised in the refined atmosphere of the Viennese court, with its emphasis on music, literature, and religious devotion, Maximilian's court was more oriented toward martial displays and outdoor pursuits. The cultural clash was immediate and painful for the young Archduchess. More humiliating still was Maximilian's open infidelity. Within months of the marriage, he had taken a mistress, Countess Agnes Franziska Monasterol, flaunting the relationship at court functions where Maria Antonia was present. For a Habsburg princess raised to believe in her dynastic superiority, this public humiliation was almost unbearable. Yet Maria Antonia understood her primary duty: to produce an heir who could potentially claim the Spanish throne. With antibiotics still centuries away from discovery, the 17th century offered little defense against serious infections. In the final days of 1692, Maria Antonia's condition deteriorated rapidly. The young Electress of Bavaria had given birth to her son Joseph Ferdinand just months earlier, a joyous occasion that fulfilled her primary dynastic duty. But childbirth in the 17th century was perilous even for the wealthiest women in Europe. Court physicians hovered anxiously around her bedside in the Munich residence, applying poultices and administering herbal remedies that had changed little since medieval times. Their bloodletting and purgatives likely weakened her further, rather than providing relief. The infection that had taken hold after childbirth proved relentless, and Maria Antonia's fever climbed higher with each passing day. On Christmas Eve 1692, with the sounds of festive preparations echoing through the palace corridors, Maria Antonia Habsburg died at the tender age of 23. Her death sent shockwaves through the royal courts of Europe. For Emperor Leopold in Vienna, the loss was deeply personal, his beloved daughter taken far too young. But beyond the personal tragedy lay a diplomatic catastrophe of the highest order. Maria Antonia had been the living embodiment of Habsburg claims to the Spanish inheritance, the crucial link between the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish throne. Her marriage to Maximilian Emanuel of Bavaria had been carefully orchestrated to secure this claim through their offspring. Now only her infant son Joseph Ferdinand remained as the vessel of Habsburg hopes for maintaining their grip on the Spanish Empire. The funeral procession through Munich's streets was a somber spectacle of Baroque grandeur. Black, draped horses pulled her casket while professional mourners wailed and courtiers walked with heads bowed in ritualized grief. For her husband Maximilian Emanuel, the loss was complicated by their strained relationship. Though he had humiliated her with his public affairs, historical accounts suggest he was genuinely affected by her passing. Perhaps he finally recognized what he had lost: not just a wife, but a direct connection to the most powerful dynasty in Europe. With Maria Antonia's death, all Habsburg hopes transferred to her infant son. Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, barely 6 months old when his mother died, suddenly became one of the most important children in Europe. The boy's significance extended far beyond Bavaria or even the Habsburg lands. He represented a potential compromise solution to the looming Spanish succession crisis. As Charles II of Spain continued his slow decline in Madrid, European powers recognized that Joseph Ferdinand, with blood ties to both the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg lines, could potentially inherit the Spanish Empire without upsetting the continental balance of power. The child's upbringing fell to a cadre of Bavarian nurses and tutors selected by his father. Maximilian Emanuel, ever ambitious, saw his son as the key to elevating Bavaria from an electorate to a kingdom. Reports from the Bavarian court describe a bright, healthy child who developed normally despite the absence of his mother. Portraits commissioned of the young prince show him dressed in miniature adult clothing, his face bearing the unmistakable Habsburg features inherited from his mother. Meanwhile, in the background, the great powers of Europe continued their diplomatic maneuvering. France's Louis XVI promoted the claims of his grandson Philip of Anjou, while Emperor Leopold advocated for his younger son, Archduke Charles. Joseph Ferdinand represented a third option, one that might prevent the continent from plunging into war. In Madrid, the last Spanish Habsburg king continued his tragic existence. Charles Sickey, severely disabled from centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, could barely function without assistance. His reign had been a study in decline, both personal and imperial. The Spanish Empire, once the most powerful in the world, was crumbling under financial strain and administrative decay. Charles had married twice but produced no children, making the succession question increasingly urgent as his health worsened. European diplomats circled like vultures, sending detailed reports about the king's deteriorating condition back to their capitals. The Spanish court became a hotbed of intrigue as French and Austrian factions competed for influence over the succession. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the existence of Joseph Ferdinand offered a glimmer of hope. A potential heir with legitimate Habsburg blood who was neither French nor Austrian, but fate had other plans for Europe. In February 1699, just 6 years after his mother's death, Joseph Ferdinand contracted smallpox, the same disease that had killed countless European royals throughout the centuries. Despite the best efforts of his physicians, the child died within days, extinguishing the compromised candidate for the Spanish succession. His death at age 6 would ultimately help trigger one of the most destructive conflicts Europe had seen: the War of Spanish Succession. With Joseph Ferdinand's death, the stage was set for a continental showdown between the Bourbons and Habsburgs that would reshape the map of Europe for centuries to come. Maria Antonia's life at the Habsburg court was marked by quiet dignity, despite the tumultuous changes in her family circumstances. Those who met her described her as quiet and serious, yet intelligent and distinguished, qualities that would serve her well in navigating the treacherous waters of Habsburg dynastic politics. The death of her mother, Margaret Theresa, cast a long shadow over her childhood, making her court life even more rigid and formal than it had already been. As the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, she was raised with exacting standards of royal etiquette, but without the softening influence of a mother's affection. The young princess barely had time to mourn her mother before a new empress arrived at court. Within mere months of Margaret Theresa's death, Emperor Leopold married his second cousin, Archduchess Claudia Felicitas of Austria, from the Tyrolese branch of the Habsburgs. This hasty remarriage was typical of royal practice. Monarchs needed heirs, and Leopold's single daughter was insufficient insurance for the dynasty's future. Despite the circumstances, Maria Antonia developed a surprisingly warm relationship with her first stepmother. Contemporary accounts suggest that Claudia Felicitas showed genuine affection for her young stepdaughter, perhaps recognizing in the serious child a kindred spirit. Their budding relationship, however, would be tragically short-lived. Just like Maria Antonia's mother, Claudia Felicitas died young, succumbing to tuberculosis in 1676 after less than 2 years of marriage. Once again, the 10-year-old princess found herself motherless in the vast Habsburg court. Leopold, undeterred by the loss of 2 young wives, soon secured a third marriage to another second cousin, Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, a German noblewoman known for her piety and strict religious observance. This marriage would prove more durable than the previous 2, with Eleanor surviving Leopold and bearing him an impressive 10 children. For Maria Antonia, this meant that almost every year brought the arrival of a new half-sibling, fundamentally altering her position at court with each birth. The most significant change in Maria Antonia's status came in 1678 with the birth of her half-brother Joseph. When this healthy male heir was born to Leopold and Eleanor, it meant that there was finally a direct male successor to Leopold's titles. The Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, Bohemia, and the Austrian hereditary lands. Maria Antonia, once the sole heir to her father's vast domains, was now relegated to being merely the heir to the Spanish throne through her mother's lineage. This shift in her dynastic importance was profound, yet it also simplified the European political chessboard in some ways. The question of whether she would succeed her uncle Charles in Madrid remained problematic, given the competing claims and the reluctance of European powers to see the Habsburg domains reunited under a single ruler. The Spanish succession question loomed ever larger as reports of Charles' size, failing health, and inability to produce heirs continued to reach Vienna. Leopold, ever the strategist, began plotting a new approach while Maria Antonia was still just a child. If his daughter could produce a son of her own, a Habsburg prince with a clear claim to the Spanish throne, This would secure Spain for their bloodline, once and for all. Such a grandson would have the advantage of being Charles Cesar's great-nephew through Maria Antonia, while avoiding the problematic union of the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg territories under a single ruler. To secure this vision of the Spanish succession, Leopold made a proposal that was shocking even by Habsburg standards of dynastic inbreeding. He intended to marry his daughter, Maria Antonia, to her own uncle, Charles Succu of Spain. At the time of this proposal, Maria Antonia was merely 6 years old, while Charles was 13. Even in a family notorious for consanguineous marriages, this proposed union between niece and uncle raised eyebrows across European courts. The genetic implications were particularly concerning given that both Maria Antonia and Charles Sicca already suffered from the accumulated effects of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. Charles himself was already showing signs of the severe physical and mental disabilities that would plague his reign. Diplomatically, the marriage would have consolidated Habsburg claims to Spain, but it would have done so at tremendous personal cost to Maria Antonia. Fortunately for the young princess, this particular marriage plan never materialized. The Spanish court advisors, concerned about Charles's health and the extreme closeness of the blood relationship, resisted the proposal. Additionally, French diplomatic pressure worked against the match, as Louis XIV had his own designs on the Spanish succession through his wife's claim. As Maria Antonia grew older, Leopold would need to find another suitable match, one that would still advance Habsburg interests in the Spanish succession crisis while being somewhat less controversial than marrying his daughter to her uncle. The young princess remained a valuable dynastic pawn, her future marriage a key piece in the complex game of European power politics that would ultimately reshape the continent. Maria Antonia's marriage to Maximilian II of Bavaria marked a significant turning point in her short life, transforming her from an Austrian archduchess to an electoral princess in a foreign court. The decision to marry Maria Antonia to Maximilian came after several failed marriage negotiations, including the collapsed engagement to her uncle Charles Sicri of Spain and the abandoned match with Victor Amadeus Sivry of Savoy. For Leopold I, this Bavarian alliance represented a strategic compromise. While not as prestigious as a Spanish match, it maintained Habsburg influence in southern Germany and potentially secured a powerful ally in the ongoing struggle for the Spanish succession. In January 1685, 16-year-old Maria Antonia departed Vienna in a grand procession befitting her status as the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. The winter journey across the snow-covered Alpine passes was arduous, with the imperial entourage traveling in ornate carriages and sleds, accompanied by hundreds of attendants, guards, and servants. Contemporary accounts describe Maria Antonia's somber demeanor as she left her childhood home, perhaps sensing the challenges that awaited her in Bavaria. Upon her arrival in Munich, she was greeted with elaborate celebrations, fountains flowing with wine, streets decorated with tapestries, and public festivities that lasted for days. The wedding ceremony at the Frauenkirche was a display of Baroque splendor, with Maria Antonia adorned in Habsburg jewels that had been worn by generations of imperial brides. Despite the outward magnificence, those close to the bride noted her reservation, a stark contrast to the gregarious enthusiasm of her new husband. The fundamental incompatibility between Maria Antonia and Maximilian became apparent almost immediately after their wedding. At 23, Maximilian was energetic, outgoing, and deeply invested in the social aspects of court life. Hunting parties, theatrical performances, and lavish banquets formed the cornerstone of his daily existence. Maria Antonia, shaped by her Habsburg upbringing and perhaps by the genetic melancholy that ran through her family, preferred intellectual pursuits, reading, music, and religious contemplation. A Venetian ambassador described her as possessed of a serious disposition, more inclined to solitude than society, finding comfort in books rather than balls. This temperamental divide was exacerbated by Maximilian's public infidelities, which began shortly after their marriage and continued throughout their time together. Unlike many royal women of her era, who stoically accepted their husbands' indiscretions, Maria Antonia was deeply wounded by these betrayals, withdrawing further into her private world of intellectual and spiritual pursuits. The Bavarian court, with its distinctly German customs and language, felt foreign to the young Habsburg princess, who had been raised in the more formal and Spanish, influenced atmosphere of Vienna. In 1691, Maximilian was appointed governor of the Spanish Netherlands, a prestigious position that reflected both his status and the continuing Habsburg influence in Spanish affairs. The couple relocated to Brussels, where they established a court that attempted to blend Spanish tradition with Bavarian sensibilities. For Maria Antonia, this move represented both a challenge and an opportunity. While further from her beloved Vienna, she was now positioned at the crossroads of European politics, in territories that were technically part of her Spanish inheritance. Life in Brussels brought new responsibilities, as she was expected to serve as the female face of Habsburg authority in the Netherlands, hosting diplomatic receptions and participating in public ceremonies. Contemporary accounts suggest that despite her natural introversion, Maria Antonia performed these duties with the dignity expected of her lineage, though she continued to seek refuge in her private apartments whenever possible. It was during this period that the strains in her marriage reached their breaking point, with Maximilian's behavior becoming increasingly disrespectful. Court gossip recorded that he openly referred to his wife as the Austrian skeleton, a cruel reference to both her Habsburg physical features and her increasingly frail health. Despite these personal challenges, Maria Antonia maintained correspondence with her father and the imperial court, remaining engaged with the ongoing negotiations regarding the Spanish succession that would determine not only her future, but that of Europe. The years in Brussels represented a paradox for Maria Antonia, physically distant from the center of Habsburg power, yet increasingly important to its dynastic ambitions. Trapped in an unhappy marriage yet fulfilling her duty to produce an heir who might one day unite the divided Habsburg inheritance. Her story reveals the deeply personal cost of dynastic politics, where individual happiness was routinely sacrificed on the altar of imperial ambition and geopolitical strategy. Maria Antonia's death on Christmas Eve 1692 cast a long shadow over the Habsburg dynasty and the future of Europe. As the imperial court mourned, her 3-month-old son Joseph Ferdinand became the focal point of international intrigue and dynastic calculation. The infant prince, born of the most inbred royal bloodline in European history, had somehow defied the odds and survived. He now represented the last viable compromise candidate for the Spanish succession, a potential solution to the looming crisis that threatened to engulf Europe in war. Joseph Ferdinand's survival was nothing short of miraculous given his genetic heritage. Both his parents carried the heavy burden of Habsburg inbreeding, yet the infant appeared healthy and robust, showing none of the physical deformities that plagued his great-uncle Charles Sexuire of Spain. His grandfather, Emperor Leopold, immediately recognized the child's strategic importance and took a keen interest in his upbringing. Despite being raised in Bavaria by his father Maximilian, Joseph Ferdinand was constantly reminded of his Spanish heritage and potential destiny. Portraits of the young prince were commissioned and sent to Madrid, where the childless Charles Sicca reportedly kept them close, seeing in this distant nephew the future of his crumbling empire. The Spanish court, desperate for any solution that might prevent their vast territories from being dismembered by foreign powers, increasingly looked to Joseph Ferdinand as their salvation. By 1696, when the boy was just 4 years old, his name was already being discussed in diplomatic circles across Europe as the most likely successor to the Spanish throne. French diplomats reported that the sickly Charles Sicca had grown fond of his great-nephew from afar, seeing in him a continuation of the Habsburg legacy without the threat of Austrian domination. As Joseph Ferdinand grew into a healthy young boy, the European powers began formal negotiations about the Spanish succession. In 1698, England, France, and the Dutch Republic signed the First Partition Treaty, officially recognizing Joseph Ferdinand as the primary heir to the bulk of the Spanish Empire. Under this agreement, the 6-year-old Bavarian prince would inherit Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, and the vast overseas colonies in the Americas and Philippines. The treaty represented a diplomatic triumph for Bavaria and a testament to Maria Antonia's lasting impact on European affairs even after her death. Her son, through the Habsburg blood she had passed to him, had become the linchpin of European stability. For Emperor Leopold, the treaty brought mixed emotions. While his grandson would inherit the Spanish throne, the Austrian Habsburgs would receive only the Duchy of Milan as compensation. Nevertheless, The agreement seemed to offer the best chance of avoiding a general European war over the Spanish succession. Joseph Ferdinand's father, Maximilian of Bavaria, saw his political fortunes transformed by his son's elevated status, despite having shown little affection for the boy's mother during her lifetime. Yet the Habsburg family curse had not finished with Maria Antonia's line. In February 1699, just months after being named heir to the Spanish Empire, Joseph Ferdinand suddenly fell ill with what physicians described as a violent fever. Within days, the 7-year-old prince was dead, likely from smallpox, the same disease that had claimed so many royal lives throughout European history. The death of Joseph Ferdinand shattered the fragile diplomatic balance that had been constructed around his inheritance. Charles II of Spain, now approaching his own death, was forced to reconsider his succession plans without the compromise candidate that Maria Antonia's son had represented. The carefully negotiated partition treaty collapsed immediately, throwing European capitals into frantic diplomatic maneuvering. France and Austria, the two powers with the strongest claims to the Spanish inheritance through their Habsburg connections, now stood directly opposed with no middle ground between them. When Charles II finally died in 1700, his controversial will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis CV of France, as his heir to the entire Spanish Empire. This decision, influenced by French diplomacy and the lack of a viable Habsburg alternative after Joseph Ferdinand's death, would plunge Europe into the devastating War of Spanish Succession. Maria Antonia's brief life and the even briefer existence of her son Joseph Ferdinand ultimately changed the course of European history. Had either of them lived longer, the Habsburg dynasty might have continued its rule over Spain, maintaining the family's position as the dominant power in Europe. Instead, their deaths contributed directly to the rise of the French Bourbons in Spain and the gradual decline of Habsburg influence in Western Europe. The genetic legacy of extreme inbreeding that had defined Maria Antonia's life continued to haunt the remaining Habsburg line. Her father, Emperor Leopold, who had arranged her marriage and placed such hopes in her offspring, would live to see the outbreak of war over the Spanish succession, but died in 1705 before its resolution. The Austrian Habsburg line would continue through Leopold's sons from his later marriages, but the family never regained the continental dominance it had once enjoyed. Maria Antonia's story serves as a poignant reminder of how individual lives, however brief, can shape the destiny of nations. A princess sacrificed to dynastic ambition. Her greatest legacy was a son who nearly changed the map of Europe, only to fall victim to the same cruel fate that had claimed his mother. In the grand tapestry of Habsburg history, Maria Antonia remains a tragic figure whose genetic inheritance and political importance far outweighed her personal happiness, a princess whose death at 23 altered the balance of power in Europe for centuries to come. Maria Antonia's son Joseph Ferdinand represented the most agile hope for Spain's future. As a healthy male descendant with strong Habsburg blood, he embodied the perfect compromise candidate for the Spanish throne during a time of increasing international tension. But with his succession still uncertain, Europe's great powers were already watching and waiting, positioning themselves for the inevitable power struggle that would follow the death of the childless Spanish king. Maria Antonia's death in 1692 cast wide open the issue of the Spanish succession, removing one of the direct claimants and shifting focus entirely to her young son. It was clear by then that her uncle Charles II could not have children, and his health was dreadful, with physical and mental disabilities that made effective rule nearly impossible. Contemporaries expected him to die every year throughout the 1690s, with foreign ambassadors sending regular reports about his declining condition and the political maneuvering happening around his sickbed. Though in the end, Charles II struggled on until late 1700, far outliving the expectations of his doctors and the patience of Europe's monarchs who awaited his demise with calculating interest. In the years following Maria Antonia's death, the Austrian Habsburgs fought fiercely to cement their claim to the Spanish throne and its vast empire, which included territories in Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines. Their argument centered on Maria Antonia's son, young Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, as the rightful heir. After all, he wasn't just any claimant to the Spanish inheritance. He was the great-grandson of King Philip IV, who had ruled Spain from 1621 to 1665, making his bloodline one of the strongest ties to the fading Spanish dynasty. Emperor Leopold I, Joseph Ferdinand's grandfather, invested considerable diplomatic effort to promote the boy's candidacy, sending envoys to Madrid and other European courts to argue for the legitimacy of the Austrian Habsburg claim. Most observers at the Spanish court agreed that Maria's son was the most eligible candidate to succeed Charles when he died, not least because he represented a neutral option that might prevent war between France and Austria. The Spanish nobility, wary of their king's ineffectual rule and concerned about the future of their global empire, increasingly looked to the young Bavarian prince as their best hope for stability. Charles II himself seemed to favor his grand-nephew, perhaps seeing in the healthy young boy everything he himself had lacked due to generations of Habsburg inbreeding. However, the French royal house of Bourbon also had a compelling claim to the Spanish inheritance, one that threatened to upset the European balance of power. Philip IV's daughter, Maria Theresa, had married Louis XIV, King of France, back in 1660, a marriage that led to many children and grandchildren who could potentially claim the Spanish throne. This marriage had originally included Maria Theresa's renunciation of her rights to the Spanish succession, but the French argued this renunciation was invalid because the promised dowry had never been paid in full. Among these French contenders was a boy named Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV and great-grandson of King Philip IV of Spain. As the second son of the Dauphin of France, Philip of Anjou represented the Bourbon dynasty's strongest claim to the Spanish throne. The prospect of a Bourbon prince inheriting the Spanish Empire terrified the other European powers, who feared the creation of a Franco-Spanish superpower that would dominate the continent. Louis XIV, already known as the Sun King for his overwhelming power and influence, conducted an aggressive diplomatic campaign to promote his grandson's interests, promising the Spanish that their empire would remain intact under Bourbon rule. Philip of Anjou might have been overlooked entirely if not for an unexpected tragedy that reshuffled the cards of European diplomacy. In 1699, Maria Antonia's only surviving son, Joseph Ferdinand, died suddenly of smallpox at the age of 6, devastating the careful plans of the Austrian Habsburgs and shocking courts across Europe. Smallpox was the deadliest disease of the era, claiming royalty and commoners alike with brutal efficiency, and even the best medical care available could do little to save its victims. With Joseph Ferdinand's death, the Austrian Habsburgs' claim to the Spanish throne was severely weakened, as their most direct and legitimate candidate had been eliminated. The tragedy left Europe's diplomats scrambling to negotiate new partition treaties, attempting to divide the Spanish inheritance among the remaining claimants to prevent the war that everyone feared was coming. Charles II, still clinging to life in Madrid, was outraged by foreign attempts to carve up his inheritance before he was even dead, and the Spanish people shared his indignation. The Spanish king, despite his physical and mental limitations, understood that his final decision about succession would shape European history for generations to come, placing an enormous burden on his shoulders. As Charles II's health deteriorated further in 1700, the question of who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire remained unresolved, with Austria and France positioning their candidates and preparing for a potential military confrontation. The death of Joseph Ferdinand had transformed what might have been a peaceful transition into a diplomatic crisis that threatened to engulf Europe in war, all because a young boy could not survive a disease that would later be eradicated from the planet. The Spanish succession crisis, set in motion by generations of Habsburg inbreeding and complicated by Maria Antonia's early death, was about to explode into one of the most significant conflicts of the early modern era. As the hopes for a peaceful resolution to the Spanish succession crisis crumbled with the death of Joseph Ferdinand, the Habsburg family was forced to dramatically shift their dynastic strategy. Emperor Leopold I, still determined to secure the Spanish inheritance for his family, now redirected his ambitions toward his younger son, Archduke Charles. This 16-year-old prince suddenly found himself thrust into the center of European power politics as the new Habsburg contender for Spain's vast global empire. The aging Spanish king, Charles II, continued his physical and mental decline throughout 1699 and 1700, with the entire continent anxiously awaiting news from Madrid. European diplomats, courtiers, and spies swarmed the Spanish capital, each attempting to influence the final decision of a man barely capable of coherent thought. On November 1, 1700, after decades of suffering, King Charles Cypri of Spain finally succumbed to the accumulated ailments that had plagued him since birth. With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled the empire for nearly 2 centuries, came to an ignominious end. In his final days, surrounded by French sympathizers and under immense pressure, Charles Sicco made a decision that would alter the course of European history. Against all expectations and contrary to Habsburg family interests, he named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir to the Spanish throne. This deathbed decision effectively handed control of the Spanish Empire to the Bourbon dynasty of France, the Habsburgs' greatest rival. The will stipulated that Philip would inherit all Spanish territories intact, preventing any partition of the empire that diplomats had been negotiating for years. News of Charles VII's death and his surprising will spread rapidly across Europe, causing shock in Vienna and jubilation in Versailles. Louis XIV, seeing the opportunity to dramatically expand French power, quickly accepted the will on behalf of his grandson, famously declaring, "There are no more Pyrenees," suggesting the mountain border between France and Spain had effectively disappeared. The Austrian Habsburgs were outraged by this development, viewing it as both a family betrayal and an existential threat to the European balance of power. Emperor Leopold refused to recognize Philip as the legitimate king of Spain and immediately began preparations to assert his son Charles's claim by force if necessary. England and the Dutch Republic, though initially hesitant, soon aligned with the Austrian position, equally alarmed by the prospect of French dominance over European affairs. Their fears were further justified when Louis XIV, in a series of provocative moves, recognized his grandson's right to the French throne despite earlier promises to keep the crowns separate. French troops moved into the Spanish Netherlands, a modern Belgium, directly threatening Dutch security and commercial interests in the region. By the spring of 1701, diplomatic solutions had been exhausted, alliances were solidified, and Europe stood on the precipice of a major conflict. On May 15, 1701, the Grand Alliance was formed between Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic, officially declaring war against France and Bourbon Spain. Thus began the War of Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that would engulf Europe for the next 13 years, causing hundreds of thousands of casualties and reshaping the continent's political landscape. The bitter irony of this devastating war was that it might have been avoided entirely had Maria Antonia or her son Joseph Ferdinand lived longer. Joseph Ferdinand, as a compromise candidate acceptable to most European powers, represented the best chance for a peaceful resolution to the succession crisis. His death from smallpox at age 6, a disease that would be eradicated from the planet centuries later, created the power vacuum that led directly to war. This conflict, like the genetic deterioration of the Habsburg line itself, can be traced back to the dynasty's centuries-long practice of inbreeding. The war raged across multiple theaters, from the Spanish peninsula to the Italian states, from the German principalities to the colonial possessions in the Americas. Legendary commanders like the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy led massive armies in some of the most significant battles of the early modern era, including Blenheim, Ramillies, and Malplaquet. After more than a decade of fighting, and with all sides exhausted, peace negotiations finally culminated in the treaties of Utrecht 1703 and Rastatt 1714. The settlement represented a compromise that fundamentally altered the European power balance. Philip V retained the Spanish throne and overseas empire, but with the crucial condition that the French and Spanish crowns could never be united under a single monarch. The Austrian Habsburgs, though failing to win Spain itself, received substantial compensation in the form of the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia, greatly expanding their presence in Italy and creating what historians would later call the Austrian Habsburg Empire. Great Britain emerged as the conflict's greatest beneficiary, securing Gibraltar, Minorca, and valuable trading rights in Spanish America, laying the groundwork for British naval supremacy in the coming century. The tragic life of Maria Antonia, born with the highest inbreeding coefficient in Habsburg history, married off for political advantage, and dead by age 23, represents a poignant human element in this grand historical drama. Had she lived longer, or had her son survived to adulthood, the map of Europe and the course of history might have been dramatically different. The War of Spanish Succession stands as the bloody culmination of the Habsburg dynasty's centuries-long practice of marrying within their family, a policy that ultimately led to their genetic deterioration and the loss of their Spanish territories. The consequences of these dynastic decisions would continue to shape European politics for generations to come, long after Maria Antonia and her Habsburg relatives were laid to rest in the imperial crypt beneath Vienna.